Let's go. All right, so guys, my name is Liam Strohs.
I'm Bo Stuckey.
And I'm Tyson Petty.
And we decided to do our country project on Somalia for international economic development. As you can see, Somalia has a mostly blue flag with a white star in the middle of it. And our first slide here is location. So Somalia is located on the Horn of Africa, which is one of the more dangerous regions of the world. Somalia borders 3 countries: Ethiopia to the west, Kenya to the southwest, and Djibouti to the northwest. Somalia is actually known for having one of the most longest coastlines of any African country. And as we can see, the U.S. State Department has issued a level 4 travel warning for Somalia, meaning travel is pretty much unsafe for almost any U.S. citizen. Pretty high risk area due to crime, terrorism, civil unrest, health issues, kidnapping, and piracy. And then there's also a few other countries that are pretty unstable in the region, one of them being Ethiopia, which is currently going through a civil war and also has a level 4 travel warning. I'll move us to the next slide here. So our next slide is gross domestic product and per capita GDP. So Somalia is known as being one of the poorest countries in the world. In its human development index, when compared to 170 countries, Somalia was among the least 5 developed of those countries. The poverty rate's nearly 73% in the country. And then unemployment is a huge problem, especially for younger people, and Somalia is mostly made up of young people. As much as 67% of youth are unemployed. And then according to the World Bank, Somalia's GDP is just below $5 billion per year. And the GDP per capita in Somalia is 310 USD. To kind of put that in perspective, the US's is nearly 64,000. And then over here, there's kind of a chart that depicts each country's GDP. And as we can see, Somalia doesn't almost register on the scale. It would be in those purple countries. Very small part of the world GDP. So kind of interesting. Human capital. So human capital is something that Somalia has really been trying to build over the last few decades. It's really been unsuccessful. The country has some pretty high levels of debt with past loans taken out at the World Bank. And it's really struggled to build any sort of infrastructure for agriculture, for like airports, roads, and bridges, very limited. But the World Bank has dedicated a lot of its resources to aiding the Somalian government, and they really want to improve the institutions in Somalia in order to improve the quality of life for people.
All right, so looking at physical capital, if we start with production, so the economy for Somalia is pretty much solely based on agriculture. They have very little industrial, yeah. The main activity is not crop farming, but is actually livestock raising. And as Liam mentioned, in the early 21st century, the country remains one of the poorest in the world. The agriculture in Somalia can be put into 2 types: nomadic pastoralism, so where people move around while raising goats, sheep, camels, and cattle. And the other type is the traditional subsistence agriculture, producing sorghum, corn, sesame, cowpeas, vegetables, and fruits as well. And then looking at labor, Liam also mentioned how young the country is. More than 40% of the population is under 15, and average life expectancy is only about 50. And so, yeah, labor is clearly going to be made up of mostly young people. And currently the unemployment rate is approximately 13%. Go ahead. Looking at technology in Somalia, there seems to be very little innovation at the moment based on the extreme conditions, considering the conflicts and the famines, everything else. Living conditions are very poor. Most people live in unsecure huts, including nomadic huts. And this is where the World Bank has invested most of its money, is into banking institutions and communication technology. Looking at resources, the raw materials in Somalia are seemingly very little. There's some minerals, and there's also some natural gas that has not been exploited yet. Looking at health, drought, flooding, locusts, and conflict have caused mass famine, and approximately 3.5 million people across Somalia are projected to face the integrated food security phase classification 3 from October to December of 2021.
So in terms of looking at Somalia's markets for their labor and production, obviously, as Tyson mentioned earlier, their biggest market is agriculture. In 2020, their agriculture was 60.2% of their gross value added to their economy, and 83% of the country's employment is within the agricultural industry. Somalia doesn't really have any industry or manufacturing production, as mentioned earlier. In 2020, it only added 7.4% of gross value, and only just above 3% of the country's employment is in the industry. And actually, surprisingly, they do have some service industry. 37.3% of gross value added was in the service industry, and 13.4% of the country's employment is within the service industry. So next. So for transportation, Somalia really doesn't have a good transportation infrastructure. They don't have any railways, and there's, as it says right there, there's really only 1,800 kilometers of paved road. It's mostly gravel, dirt, or just kind of trekking across the landscape. In the urban areas, it's mostly buses, trucks, and minibuses, kind of as the picture shows on the left. It's limited amounts of those vehicles, so people just cram on them. And then kind of to go along with the nomadic agricultural aspect in the rural areas, it's a lot of camels and donkeys and cattle that people ride on. And they did have an airline until 1991, and like a national airline, but that is no longer in operation. And then Mogadishu, Berbera, and Kismayo all have private airlines for the wealthy elites within the country. So education is a big issue within Somalia. It is our particular issue we're focusing on. In 2017, the gross enrollment rate for primary education was only just above 32%. So this means about 67% of Somalia's school-aged children are not being educated at the primary level. Surprisingly, the gross enrollment rate in 2017 for secondary education was 18%, which is also really low. And in 2017, only 5% of Somalia's national budget was allocated for education. And it says right there, private education accounts for approximately 70% of Somali schools, because there is no national public education system like we have here in the US. In Western Europe, it's just not a thing. And really, Somalia's education system is terrible. It's dwindling. It is, in my opinion, the biggest issue facing the country for development. So next slide.
So I guess we kind of wanted to wrap up with how to improve Somalia's education. Obviously we kind of had three main points. I guess I'll kind of speak to the first one that we put, is we really think that Somalia should continue working with the World Bank and maybe some other advanced UN nations for funding and other resources, and even to look for examples on how to build education in a developing country. We really think that if Somalia is able to improve its education system, that everything else with inside its economy will eventually improve.
Yeah. Speaking to the second point, Somalia is a really dangerous, crime-ridden, corrupt country. And, when that's really your main source of industry, there is piracy and crime. And so you have to provide kind of a safe education, center and culture for children to go to and improve their living condition. So yeah.
Yeah, and if I can speak to the last point, we want to provide economic incentives for Somalis to become teachers. This really has to do with the labor force, but also we want to provide economic incentives to Somalis to actually be able to go to school. As Bo mentioned, of almost 70% of school-age children are not able to be in school, whether this is transportation or just the fact that many of these kids are having to work on the farms or work in the businesses of their parents. So we want to find ways to get these kids out of the fields and into the classroom.
All right, well, this is our sources slide. I guess thank you so much for joining us, for learning about Somalia. Bo, Tyson, I'll let you guys add on anything if you'd like right here, but guess that's about it for us. So we appreciate your time. See ya.
Thank